So today our topic is apoptosis, right? And what do you mean by apoptosis in general terms? So we can say apoptosis is nothing but cell death, right? So what do you mean by apoptosis? Apoptosis is nothing but just the cell death or death of a cell. We can just simplify this in simple words. So, apoptosis word came from the Latin, or we can say Latin word, which is split into two words, apo and tosis. Apo in general means from, and tosis means falling. So the cell undergoes falling, or the cell undergoes cell death, and that term is scientifically called as apoptosis. So we are clear here that what is apoptosis? Apo means from and tosis means falling, and from falling we lead to death of the cell, right? Then what is apoptosis? So we define apoptosis as a biochemical process, right? That means it is a biochemical process which is energy dependent, right? Energy dependent, as well as so when we define apoptosis, we say that apoptosis is a biochemical process which is energy dependent, as well as called as programmed cell death, or here programmed events of cell death occurs, right? So if we say it is a biochemical process, then it involves all the chemicals which are present in our body, and all those chemicals are involved and they react to take the cell to the death process, right? Energy dependent means ATP, energy in the form of ATP is utilized in this, and programmed event of cell death means here events occur one after another, so program is fixed there, right? So it is also called as programmed cell death, right? That means all processes are predefined that how the cell will undergo death. So programs are fixed one after another. Now, when we say that who gives the stimulus for the cell death process, so we can say external stimulus can arrive here and lead the cell to the death, right? But stimulus can be internal as well, right, within the cell as well, and they are called as endogenous stimuli, right? The stimulus can be of two types, external or internal. External stimulus comes from outside the cell or outside surrounding or outside from the environment, right? Internal stimuli come from within the cell, or they are also called as endogenous stimuli, which leads the cell to the death process. So in this way, apoptosis is defined and concerned. Now we see that apoptosis is a general process, right? We say it is a general process and it occurs in our body many times, right? So it can occur during the embryogenesis, during metamorphosis, it can occur during differentiation, and during tissue turnover as well, right? So it can occur during any of the process, whether it is embryogenesis or embryo formation process, cell death can occur. Metamorphosis process also involves cell death or apoptosis. Even differentiation process also involves cell death, and even the tissue turnover process also involves cell death. So this is a general process, we can say, and it can occur during any phase of the life. Even in the adult stage also cell death occurs. So from the embryo stage to the adult old age, at that time as well, cell death or apoptosis process occurs, and it is a very important phenomenon of our body on which many of the functions depend, or many of the structures depend, right? Like when we talk about metamorphosis process, we here observe that during metamorphosis, for example, we take the example of a frog, right? So during the metamorphosis of frog from tadpole to the adult frog conversion, there tadpole has a tail region, we observe, and then tail is at the adult stage, this tail is removed or regressed, right? It is removed. So how the tail is removed? Due to apoptotic process or apoptosis. This is the only reason why tail is removed. So metamorphosis contains a kind of apoptotic process, and due to this only adult structures are formed. So we can say it is a very important process. Secondly, we can say that every cell has its specified lifespan, right? Like we talk about if RBC, it is 120 days lifespan, right? It can live up to 120 days only, and then cell death occurs. So after the completion of lifespan of each cell, every cell undergoes cell death process or apoptosis process. So it is a common process. Second thing what we call about apoptosis is that if some tissues are worn out, right, or disrupted, then also they undergo apoptosis to lead them to the cell death process and remove them from there, so that normal functioning of the body can be maintained. So this is all in general introduction of apoptosis. That what is apoptosis and is this a general process, where it occurs, and during which stage this process occurs, right? Now when we talk about apoptosis, it involves three processes, right? So we can say processes of apoptosis. There are three processes of apoptosis. When we discuss about the cell, what does a cell contains? This is of utmost importance, right? A cell contains what? So we say cell is bound by a membrane, so cell membrane is present, right? Nucleus is present, and called as cell membrane, cytoplasm and nucleus. So now on all three major components, different actions takes place to lead to the death pathway, right? So number one, we will talk about the nucleus. The nucleus contains the chromatin material, right? It has chromatin material, and chromatin material is made up of DNA plus protein, right? So chromatin material is made up of DNA and protein combination, and nucleus has this material. So what happens here is one enzyme called as endonuclease. One enzyme called as endonuclease works on these DNA material and it breaks down the DNA, or we can say fragmentation of DNA occurs. Right? So endonuclease fragments the DNA and breaks down into very short pieces. Right? Suppose DNA is present like this and endonuclease works here, and it just what does? It breaks down into very short segments. Right, so it is made non-functional here, right? Second step occurs to cytoplasm. Right, cytoplasm contains many organelles there, as well as we can say sap portion is also present there. So the water, or we can say the soluble forms of the cytoplasm are excreted out, we can say they come out, and cytoplasm squeezes, right, or we can say contracts. So it gets squeezes. These changes are happening, right? So cytoplasm, as a result, we can say it shrinks and releases all the type of particles from there to the outside. Then third region comes is the cell membrane. Now, cell membrane also undergoes changes. So, we say this is a cell membrane. This cell membrane gets divided into different small bodies, right? Breaks off and gets divided into different small bodies. And these small bodies are called as apoptotic bodies, right? So these apoptotic bodies are later on eaten up by the macrophage. This is a macrophage. So they are eaten up by the macrophage, or macrophage engulf them, right? So as a result, cell undergoes cell death process or apoptotic process. So we can just revise this thing that cell has three major components. Firstly, endonuclease come and work on the DNA, right? And just fragments the DNA into very short pieces and make it inactive, right? Secondly, cytoplasm shrinks and we can say it contracts. So all the materials present there comes out. And thirdly, cell membrane. Here the cell membrane breaks off and make small vesicles like structure, and this vesicle like structure is called as, we can say, apoptotic bodies or apoptosome. engulfed by the macrophage and all the components, major components of the cell are destroyed in such a way, right? So here is the process of apoptosis. Why we have made teeth-like structure, that is it is just engulfing it, so we had made like structure. Macrophage structure is not like this. I have just made it to remember that it is eating all these apoptosis, right? So these are three processes of apoptosis. Now, we can say that there are two processes of cell death. One is apoptosis and the other one is necrosis. Right? So we consider that what is the difference between the two processes. Right? So when we discuss the differences, we can say that apoptosis is energy dependent process. Right? We all know it is energy dependent process. But when we discuss about necrosis, it is a kind of energy independent process. Alright? So, next difference is apoptosis is a biological process. Right? It is a kind of biological process which occurs naturally, right? And when we say about or talk about necrosis, so we say this process occurs due to the acute external stress applied to the cell. Right? So, thirdly we talk about apoptosis is that it does not affect the neighboring cells, or we can say adjacent cells. It affects the adjacent cells because during cell death it spills its content to the outside affecting other cells. Now I suppose that the difference between apoptosis and necrosis should be clear to all of you. So first we will discuss what is necrosis. It is just, we can say, energy independent process. That means ATP or any kind of energy is not needed in this process, right? Secondly, it is not a biological process. It is not a general process. It just occurs when there is external stress to the cell, right? External stress, external pressure is applied to the cell, then necrosis process occurs. So it is not a biological process, not a general process. It is just occurring due to the external stress, right? And if the cell gets stress from the outside, then what will happen? It will spill out all the contents outside, right? It will spill out all the contents outside of the cell, and as a result, the adjacent cells will get affected. affected by this, right? Because the contents are spilled out, so adjacent cells get in contact with that content, and as a result they get affected, right? So when we can say, when we differentiate both the processes, so it is energy dependent process, it is energy independent process. It is a biological process, occurs naturally, right? It is not a biological process, doesn't occur naturally, but it occurs due to the acute external stress applied to the cell. Thirdly, it does not affect the neighboring cells because macrophages are there to clean all the cell contents, right? And here it affects the adjacent cells because during the cell death, it spills its content to the outside and just affecting other cells. So this is the difference between both these processes. Now, we will discuss about the pathways of apoptosis, right? There are 3 pathways of apoptosis, right? First is extrinsic, second is intrinsic, and third is granzyme. Right. So there are 3 pathways of apoptosis. Now we can see how these pathways work. Right? This is the process occurring there. And in this, again, we see these are the three processes occurring here. Now, when we talk about the first process, that is the extrinsic process. Extrinsic means external. That means signals for the apoptosis are coming from the external of the cell, right? From the external environment, signals are coming. That's why it is called as extrinsic pathway, right? So what happens in the extrinsic pathway is that fast L and fast bind to each other. When fast L and fast will bind to each other, there will be a signal cascading, right? So after their binding, procaspase 8 protein is present in the cell, right? This protein gets activated to the caspase 8 protein. So we can say this is the inactive form of the protein and this is the active form of the protein which is present inside the cell. So after binding, it gets activated to caspase 8 and as a result, caspase 8 leads to the cell death, right, or leads to the apoptosis process. So these signals are coming from the external of the cell environment. So they are called as extrinsic pathway, right? Now, what is fast L and what is fast, right? Fast L is present on the T killer lymphocytes or T lymphocytes, which helps in the killing of the cell. That's why they are called as T killer lymphocytes, right? So on T killer lymphocytes, fast L, or we can say the ligands of the fast are present. L means ligand, right? So ligand is present of the fast, right? Fast is a kind of protein. And here on the cell itself, receptor, or we can say fast R, or receptor for the fast is present. So when ligand and receptors of the same protein family, of the same fast family bind to each other, or we can say when ligand binds to the receptor, cascade process occurs and here procaspase 8, which is present there in the form of an inactive protein, it gets activated to the caspase 8. Maybe here some phosphorylation activity is taking place which is activating it, right, and leads to the cell death. So we say the signals are coming from the T killer lymphocytes which have ligands for this and ligands bind to the receptors. Receptors receive the signals and activates the cell to undergo the cell death process. That's why it is called as extrinsic pathway. Second pathway is called as intrinsic pathway. That means signals are coming from within the cell, right, or from the internal environment of the cell. So these are intrinsic pathway. Now what happens is some damage to the mitochondria occurs and as a result of stress or damage, mitochondria breaks off, right? It breaks off. And when mitochondria breaks off, what what is released outside is cytochrome C. Cytochrome C we have already discussed in the ETS cycle where ATP formation is involved, right? So cytochrome C is present in the mitochondria, and after the breakage of mitochondria, cytochrome C comes out of the mitochondria. So as a result, APF1 also combines with cytochrome C. And what is APAF1? It is apoptotic protease activating factor. Right? It is a kind of protease activating factor which combines with the cytochrome C. And both these bodies combine with the procaspase 9 protein present inside the cell. So these three bodies combine together and they form here the apoptosome. Right? So as a result, apoptosome or apoptotic body is formed. Now, this apoptosome activates when both these cells or both these type of tissues, proteins or enzymes combine with procaspase 9, they activate it and forms caspase 9. It is inactive form, it is the active form. So, activates the caspase 9. Right? Caspase 9 in turn, if it gets activated, then signal cascade process occurs. That means it gives signals to the other cell to get activated, right? So after the activation of caspase 9, it activates procaspase 3, which is converted to caspase 3. So caspase 3 is activated. It is the activated form, and as a result, it will lead to the death of the cell. And those three processes which we have already studied, cytoplasm, shrinkage, cell membrane changes and DNA fragmentation, all three processes occurs in this. So caspase 3 leads to the death of the cell. And here in apoptosis, only the target cell is led to the death. Adjacent cells are not disturbed at all. Right? So that's why this type of pathway occurs. So it is called as intrinsic pathway because signals are received from within the cell. Right? Mitochondria breaks, releases cytochrome C, combines with APAF1, procaspase 9 here combines, forms apoptosome, ATP is also present here, and as a result caspase 9 is activated. It activates further on caspase 3 and then led to the death. Right? So this is intrinsic pathway. Thirdly, we talk about the granzyme pathway. Granzyme, what are granzymes? Firstly, we will discuss that. Granzymes are nothing but we can say granules present in the cytoplasm of the cell. They are just the granules form present in the cytoplasm of the cell. And they are nothing just serine protease. Right? They have the function of protease. They are serine protease. That means serine amino acid is attached to them. So they are serine protease. Now, granzyme is present in two forms, granzyme A and granzyme B. What granzyme A does is it leads to the fragmentation of the DNA. So this is known as DNA fragmentation. So granzyme A is responsible for DNA fragmentation and granzyme B is responsible for the activation of the caspase 10, right? So it activates the caspase 10 protein. And further on, when caspase 10 is activated, it leads to the activation of caspase 3 protein, right? It activates cell death and leads to the cell death or apoptosis. So this is called as granzyme pathway because here granzymes are used as a way of pathway which leads to the death of the cell. They can be of two types. Granzyme B leads to the activation of caspase 10 and further caspase 3 is activated and as a result cell death occurs. So in this way there are three phase occur depends on the factors responsible behind